Imagine for a second that you are a mining engineer. Not the glamorous kind working in Silicon Valley, but the real deal. You're standing on permafrost in northern Siberia at -40 degrees, watching the sun barely peek over the horizon even though it's noon. You're overseeing the extraction of nickel, palladium, and rare earth minerals worth billions of dollars. The stuff that powers electric cars, smartphones, fighter jets, and every piece of green technology the world claims to want. You look around at the endless frozen wasteland and realize something terrifying. This isn't a wasteland anymore. This is the most valuable real estate on planet Earth. Welcome to Russia's Arctic. It's 53% of the entire Arctic coastline. It holds 90 billion barrels of undiscovered oil, 669 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, and some of the world's largest deposits of nickel, cobalt, platinum, and rare earth elements. Russia has spent the last 2 decades quietly building the world's most powerful Arctic military presence. 475 military bases, more than all of NATO combined. Nuclear icebreakers, hypersonic missiles, strategic bombers stationed on islands you've never heard of, 200 miles from Alaska. And here is the part that should keep you up at night. As the Arctic ice melts, Russia isn't just defending territory. They're creating a new global trade route that could shift the entire balance of economic and military power away from the West. The Northern Sea Route could cut shipping times between Asia and Europe by 40%, saving 20 days of travel and billions in fuel costs. Russia controls it. China wants it. And NATO just realized it's catastrophically unprepared. Today we're going to dissect the most important geopolitical shift nobody's talking about. How climate change handed Russia a strategic jackpot. How Putin is turning frozen tundra into a military fortress. And why the Arctic might be where World War III actually starts. Buckle up. The ice is melting and the race is on. 1. The geography of power. Why the Arctic actually matters. Let's start with the uncomfortable truth. For most of human history, the Arctic was strategically worthless. It was frozen solid 9 months a year, impossibly expensive to operate in, and offered nothing except misery and frostbite. The Soviet Union maintained some military presence during the Cold War, but even they mostly abandoned it after 1991. Bases were shuttered, equipment rusted. The Arctic became a geopolitical afterthought. Then the climate started changing, and it changed fast. The Arctic is warming at 4 times the global average. Let that sink in. While the rest of the world debates fractions of a degree, the Arctic is experiencing what scientists call Arctic amplification. Since 1979, Arctic sea ice has declined by about 13% per decade. In September 2024, Arctic sea ice averaged just 3.9 million square kilometers, the lowest extent recorded since satellite measurements began. Parts of the Northern Sea Route that used to be impassable year-round are now ice-free for months. This isn't some distant future scenario. It's happening right now. And Russia saw it coming. Russia's Arctic Zone of the Russian Federation, their official designation for Arctic territory, represents 53% of the entire Arctic coastline. That's more than Canada, the United States, Norway, Denmark, and Iceland combined. It's not even close. And they have 24,140 kilometers of Arctic coast. Nobody else has more than a few thousand. What does that translate to in practical terms? Control. Russia controls access to the Northern Sea Route, the shipping lane that runs along their northern coast from the Barents Sea to the Bering Strait. When fully operational, this route shaves 7,000 kilometers off the journey from Shanghai to Rotterdam compared to the Suez Canal. That's 40% shorter distance, 20 to 30 days faster transit time, and massive fuel savings. During 2021 pilot voyages, Chinese shipping giant COSCO saved 6,900 tons of fuel and over $9 million across just 14 trips. Now imagine that route operating year-round, escorted by Russian nuclear icebreakers, with toll fees going straight to Moscow. That's not a hypothetical. Russia's state nuclear corporation Rosatom already manages the Northern Sea Route and operates 45 icebreakers, including 8 nuclear-powered vessels. Nobody else even comes close. The entire US Coast Guard has one functioning heavy icebreaker, and it broke down in July 2024 during its Arctic patrol. 1 icebreaker. Russia has 45, but shipping routes are just the opening act. The real prize is underneath the ice. 2. Trillions under the ice. The resource bonanza. According to the US Geological Survey, the Arctic holds 90 billion barrels of undiscovered technically recoverable oil, 669 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, and 44 billion barrels of natural gas liquids. That's 13% of the world's undiscovered oil and 30% of the world's undiscovered natural gas in a single region, and 84% of it is offshore, locked under the seabed that's only now becoming accessible as the ice recedes. Russia's share is staggering. The West Siberian Basin, the East Barents Basins, and offshore areas near Russia's Arctic coast contain over 70% of the Arctic's undiscovered natural gas. At current global prices, we're talking about trillions of dollars in natural resources. Not millions. Not billions. Trillions. Or more. But oil and gas are yesterday's story. The real geopolitical weapon is critical minerals. Russia's Arctic produces 40% of the world's palladium, 15% of its platinum, 10% of its nickel. These aren't luxury goods. Palladium is essential for catalytic converters in cars and semiconductor manufacturing. Platinum is critical for hydrogen fuel cells and medical devices. Nickel is the backbone of electric vehicle batteries and stainless steel production. The Russian government estimates that 95% of the country's platinum group metals reserves, 74% of nickel reserves, 55% of cobalt reserves, and 61% of rare earth metals reserves are concentrated in the Arctic region. The Kola Peninsula alone, that chunk of land near Murmansk, holds Europe's largest deposit of platinum group metals at the Fedorovo tundra site. Russia is developing lithium deposits in the same region, with the Kolmozerskoye deposit containing 75 million tons of lithium reserves, enough to produce 45,000 tons of lithium carbonate annually. Think about what that means. The entire green energy transition, every electric car, every solar panel inverter, every wind turbine generator, depends on these minerals, and Russia is sitting on a ridiculous percentage of the global supply, in the Arctic, behind a wall of ice that's melting, with exclusive economic zones extending 200 miles from their coast. This is a natural resources monopoly forming in real time, and Putin knows exactly what he has. 3. Fortress Arctic. The military build-up. Nobody saw coming. In the last decade, while the West was busy with Afghanistan, Syria, and internal political drama, Russia was quietly turning the Arctic into the most militarized zone on the planet. Russia has 32 continuously attended military sites in the Arctic as of 2024. NATO combined has 37. But that statistic is deeply misleading, because Russia's bases are strategic masterpieces, while NATO's are scattered defensive positions. Russia has reopened more than 50 Soviet-era military bases that were abandoned after the Cold War. But they didn't just dust them off. They modernized them into dual-use facilities that combine military defense with support for resource extraction and shipping. Let me give you some examples that should terrify anyone paying attention. Kotelny Island. The Severny Clever Base, also called Northern Trefoil because of its distinctive cloverleaf shape, opened in 2013 with massive publicity. It houses 150 troops and sophisticated S-400 surface-to-air missile systems with a range of 400 kilometers. The Temp Air Base on the western shore of Kotelny just completed a major upgrade in 2024, extending its runway to 2,100 meters and 130 meters wide. That runway can now handle all but the largest Russian military and civilian aircraft, including long-range interceptors and nuclear-capable bombers. France Joseph Land. The Nagorskoye Air Base on this remote archipelago has been expanded to support MiG-31 interceptors and strategic bombers. This is Russia's northernmost military outpost, closer to the North Pole than to Moscow. From here, Russian aircraft can patrol the entire central Arctic. Novaya Zemlya. The Rogachevo Air Base is getting a 5-year modernization plan approved by the Russian Defense Ministry. The runway is being extended to handle Tu-95 and Tu-160 strategic bombers, the same aircraft that can launch cruise missiles with 500-kilometer ranges. This archipelago, by the way, is where the Soviet Union tested the largest nuclear weapon ever detonated, the Tsar Bomba. The symbolism is not subtle. Wrangel Island, right across the Bering Strait from Alaska. From Alaska, Russia has positioned forces and radar systems here that can monitor everything happening in the Pacific Arctic approach. The Kola Peninsula is Russia's Arctic crown jewel. This is where the Northern Fleet, Russia's most powerful naval force, is headquartered at Severomorsk. The peninsula has received massive infrastructure upgrades, including expansion of the Gadzievo submarine base and new weapons bunkers at Okolnia Bay. Russia's ballistic missile submarines operate from here, carrying the country's second strike nuclear capability. The entire area is blanketed by anti-access/area denial systems, S-400 missiles, electronic warfare capabilities, and submarine detection networks. This isn't defensive positioning. This is layered, redundant, offensive capability. Russia has created an Arctic fortress designed to control sea lanes, project power, and if necessary, shut down NATO's ability to operate in the region. And here is the kicker. Even while pouring resources into the Ukraine war, Russia has continued upgrading these Arctic bases. They're not slowing down, they're accelerating. We're just getting started. In the next section, we're going to look at how China is bankrolling this Arctic expansion and what that means for the New World Order. If you want to understand global power shifts without the mainstream media spin, make sure you hit that subscribe button. It helps the algorithm way more than sanctions help NATO. Also, let me know in the comments, do you think the Arctic is the next major conflict zone, or am I being too dramatic? I read every comment. 4. The Polar Silk Road. When dictatorships collaborate in 2018, China published its first Arctic policy white paper. It introduced a concept called the Polar Silk Road. This wasn't subtle. This wasn't diplomatic language buried in footnotes. China literally declared the Arctic as part of its Belt and Road Initiative and announced plans to develop shipping routes, resource extraction, and infrastructure in partnership with Russia. Let's be clear about what's happening. China has no Arctic territory. None. Zero. It's not an Arctic nation by any geographic definition. But China declared itself a near-Arctic state and positioned itself as a stakeholder with legitimate interests in Arctic governance. The audacity is breathtaking. It's like me declaring myself a near-billionaire and demanding a seat at Davos. But China backed up the rhetoric with cash. Lots of cash. In 2013, China National Petroleum Corporation bought a 20% stake in Russia's Yarmol LNG project, a massive liquefied natural gas facility in the Arctic. The project was valued at $27 billion, and China committed billions in financing when Western banks were backing away due to sanctions. China then invested in Arctic LNG 2, another massive project, and signed agreements to develop port infrastructure along the Northern Sea Route. By 2024, Chinese shipping companies had completed multiple transits through the Northern Sea Route. Chinese icebreakers, including the Shuilong and Shuilong 2, conduct regular Arctic research missions. In August 2025, a Chinese polar fleet operated just 290 nautical miles from Alaska. And here is where it gets interesting. Chinese state-owned companies are building ice-class container ships specifically designed for Arctic operations. They're not preparing for someday. They're preparing for right now. On October 14, 2025, Russia and China signed a comprehensive agreement to jointly develop the Northern Sea Route. This isn't a memorandum of understanding. This is a binding partnership that formalizes Chinese investment, Russian operational control, and shared economic benefits. The agreement includes provisions for year-round navigation supported by Russia's nuclear icebreaker fleet, Chinese cargo volume guarantees, and infrastructure development funded by Chinese banks. Think about the strategic implications. Russia gets the capital it desperately needs under Western sanctions. China gets alternative trade routes that bypass choke points like the Strait of Malacca and the Suez Canal. Together they create an economic corridor that sidelines NATO, the EU, and American influence. But it goes deeper than economics. China and Russia have conducted joint naval patrols near Alaska in 2022 and 2023. Chinese and Russian bombers flew together within the Alaskan Air Defense Identification Zone in July 2024. In 2024, Chinese naval vessels conducted what they explicitly described to the US Coast Guard as freedom of navigation operations in the Bering Sea. This is military coordination masquerading as standard procedure. The 2024 US Department of Defense Arctic Strategy lists PRC activities in the Arctic first when discussing the strategic environment, ahead of even Russian activities. That's not an accident. The Pentagon sees what's coming. Two authoritarian powers, increasingly isolated from the West, finding common cause in a region where NATO has been asleep at the wheel. 5. Climate change as geopolitical weapon. Here is the darkest irony of this entire situation. The very climate change that Western nations claim to be fighting is handing Russia and China a geopolitical jackpot. Every tenth of a degree of warming makes the Arctic more accessible. Every kilometer of retreating sea ice opens new shipping lanes, new drilling sites, new strategic positions. Climate models suggest that by 2050 the northern sea route could be navigable year-round for Polar Class 7 vessels, which are the least ice-capable ships still classified for Arctic operations. By 2100, the route could be open to conventional shipping for months at a time. What was once a seasonal experiment is becoming a permanent alternative to traditional trade routes. Russia is not worried about climate change. They're capitalizing on it. While European nations shut down nuclear plants and lecture about carbon footprints, Russia is building the infrastructure to exploit the melting Arctic. They're not fighting climate change. They're weaponizing it. Consider the absurdity. The West imposes sanctions on Russian fossil fuels to punish Moscow for invading Ukraine and to force a green transition. Meanwhile, climate change is making Russia's Arctic fossil fuel reserves more accessible and more valuable. The sanctions are failing while the climate is literally working in Russia's favor. Arctic shipping traffic along the northern sea route has already hit 400,000 tons in 2025. Moscow projects annual cargo traffic could reach tens of millions of tons by 2030. Each ship that uses the northern sea route instead of the Suez Canal pays Russia for icebreaker escort services, generates revenue for Russian ports, and strengthens Moscow's control over global trade flows. And here is the feedback loop from hell. Increased Arctic shipping accelerates warming because ships bring black carbon emissions, disrupt ice formation, and warm the water through their very presence. The more ships use the northern sea route, the faster the ice melts. The faster the ice melts, the more accessible the route becomes. Russia wins either way. 6. NATO's belated panic. For years, NATO treated the Arctic as a peaceful, stable region. The phrase you'll hear constantly is low-tension area. NATO officials genuinely believed that cooperation in Arctic governance through institutions like the Arctic Council would prevent militarization. They were catastrophically wrong. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, everything changed. Finland and Sweden, historically neutral countries, applied to join NATO specifically because of Russian aggression. Their accession in 2023 and 2024 meant that 7 of the 8 Arctic Council members are now NATO allies. Only Russia stands outside. Moscow immediately characterized this as hostile encirclement and used it to justify further military buildup. Putin sealed off large swathes of the Barents Sea, including parts of Norway's exclusive economic zone, for Russia's Zapad 2025 military exercises. Russian submarines and surface vessels now regularly patrol deep into areas that NATO assumed were secure. NATO's response has been late and inadequate. The United States and Finland announced a joint initiative to build 11 icebreakers to strengthen Arctic presence. That sounds impressive until you remember Russia has 45, including 8 nuclear-powered behemoths. Those icebreakers won't be ready until well into the 2030s. By then, Russia will have consolidated control. European NATO members are finally increasing military exercises in the Arctic. The Nordic response exercises in 2024 involved thousands of troops training above the Arctic Circle in Norway. But training exercises are not the same as permanent bases, forward-deployed equipment, or the kind of comprehensive infrastructure Russia has been building for 15 years. 4 Arctic experts told Reuters in 2022 that it would take the West at least 10 years to catch up with Russia's military in the region. That assessment, if anything, was optimistic. NATO is trying to plug gaps in a region where Russia has already established dominance, its defense playing catch-up to a fence that's been planning for decades. The Arctic Council, once a model of international cooperation, is effectively frozen. After Russia's Ukraine invasion, all Arctic Council members except Russia boycotted meetings for over a year. When they finally reconvened in 2023 to hand the chairmanship to Norway, it was purely procedural. There is no trust. There is no cooperation. There is just strategic competition. 7. The hybrid war. You're not watching Russia isn't just building military bases and shipping lanes. They're conducting a comprehensive hybrid warfare campaign in the Arctic that most people aren't even aware of. In 2022, a fiber-optic cable connecting mainland Norway to the Svalbard archipelago was severed. Suspicion immediately fell on Russia because a Russian fishing vessel was in the area at the time. That cable supported a satellite station and provided internet to the Arctic archipelago. Coincidence? Unlikely. In 2023 and 2024, there have been multiple incidents of undersea cables damaged in the Baltic Sea. While these aren't technically Arctic, they're part of the same pattern. Critical infrastructure mysteriously fails near Russian vessels. Insurance companies now treat this as standard risk rather than isolated incidents. Russian military aircraft routinely violate Scandinavian airspace. Not occasionally, routinely. Norwegian and Finnish fighters scramble multiple times per month to intercept Russian jets that deliberately penetrate their airspace, test response times and probe defensive gaps. Electronic warfare and GPS jamming have become so common in the Arctic that commercial airlines and shipping companies now build in contingencies. Russia operates sophisticated jamming systems from its Arctic bases that can disrupt navigation and communications across huge areas. They test these systems regularly, sometimes during NATO exercises just to prove they can. In July 2024, Ukrainian forces allegedly hit the Olenia airbase in northwestern Russia with a drone strike, demonstrating that even Russia's Arctic facilities are vulnerable. Russia's response was to accelerate air defense deployments and further harden its Arctic infrastructure. The vulnerability didn't make them pull back, it made them double down. This is grey zone warfare perfected. Never quite enough to trigger Article 5, but constant enough to degrade NATO capabilities, test resolve, and establish dominance through intimidation. 8. The canary in the coal mine. Before you sit back and think, this is just a regional dispute in a frozen wasteland, let me give you a warning. The Arctic is not isolated. It's a preview of how great power competition will unfold in the 21st century. Look at the pattern. Climate change creates new strategic opportunities. Authoritarian powers move aggressively to seize them while democracies debate. Economic and military objectives become indistinguishable. Critical infrastructure becomes both target and weapon. Hybrid warfare makes traditional deterrence obsolete. Alliances based on shared values lose to alliances based on shared interests. Russia's Arctic strategy is the template. They're using it in the Black Sea, the Baltic, Central Asia, and the Middle East. China is watching, learning, and applying similar principles in the South China Sea, around Taiwan, and increasingly in the Pacific. The Arctic shows us what happens when the West assumes cooperation will continue, while adversaries plan for competition. NATO thought shared Arctic Council membership meant shared interests. Russia saw it as cover for military buildup. NATO thought climate change was an environmental issue. Russia saw it as a strategic opportunity. NATO thought economic interdependence would prevent conflict. Russia and China saw it as leverage. Every assumption NATO made about the Arctic was wrong. And those same assumptions are being applied to other contested regions right now. The South China Sea, the Western Pacific, space, cyberspace. The pattern repeats. If Russia succeeds in establishing Arctic dominance, it demonstrates that military power, not international law, determines access to resources and trade routes. It proves that patient, long-term strategic planning beats reactive democratic decision-making. It shows that authoritarian coordination can outmaneuver alliance structures built on consensus. The Arctic is the canary in the coal mine. And the canary is not just sick, it's dying. Final thoughts. So can the West respond? Can NATO claw back lost ground and prevent Russian-Chinese domination of the Arctic? The honest answer is maybe, but the window is closing fast. There are some positive signs. Finland and Sweden joining NATO gives the alliance two countries with genuine Arctic expertise and capabilities. Norway is increasing its defense spending and upgrading northern bases. The United States is finally allocating serious money to Arctic infrastructure, though the timeline is measured in decades, not years. But the math is brutal. Russia has a 15-year head start, geographic advantage, nuclear icebreakers, permanent infrastructure, and no budget constraints tied to democratic oversight. China has unlimited capital and a willingness to invest in decades-long projects. Together, they have the combination of operational capability and financial resources that NATO is struggling to match. The real question is whether Western nations have the political will to make Arctic security a priority before it's too late. Right now, the Arctic competes with Ukraine, Taiwan, the Middle East, climate policy, domestic politics, and about 47 other crises for attention and funding. Russia doesn't have that problem. For Moscow, the Arctic is the priority. Climate change isn't slowing down. The ice will continue melting. The northern sea route will become more accessible. critical mineral deposits will become more economically viable. The question is whether the Arctic becomes a zone of cooperation based on international law, or a militarized frontier controlled by whoever has the strongest military presence. Right now, Russia is winning. And the rest of the world is only just starting to notice. And for you, the lesson is simple. When you hear politicians talk about climate change, ask them about the Arctic. When you hear about electric vehicles and green technology, ask them about critical mineral dependency. When you hear about international cooperation, ask them about Russia's 475 military bases in a region that's supposedly demilitarized. The Arctic is the future of geopolitical competition, and that future is already here. If you want to understand the next major conflict zone before it becomes front-page news, watch our upcoming video on how China is using rare earth minerals to hold the entire West hostage. It makes the Arctic look like a warm-up act. Mold? And if this video opened your eyes to what's really happening in the frozen north, hit that like button. The algorithm rewards engagement more than sanctions reward virtue signaling. See you in the next one.